florals have been going on for a long time. The Egyptians, some of the tombs they've discovered, because it's so dry and arid there, they found whole floral tributes, like sprays of dried flowers. Those collars they wore were oftentimes sewed with palm. They used a lot of flowers. They even did they even had special vases for lotuses. So we know that they were doing. We don't know exactly what their funeral customs were, but we know they used floral tributes as part of their funeral customs. Same with the Greeks and the Romans. Now, early Christians did not like garlands and wreaths, no matter how, because they garlanded sacrificial animals being led to sacrifice on pagan altars. Jews had always liked the big bridal crown in ancient Israel was myrtle, just a plain green myrtle. Okay, Jews rejected this. The reason Christians did in the early days. Christians later gave them Christian meanings, like the wreath, eternal life. The white lily represented the Virgin Mary. And as time went by, Christians started adopting the use more. In the Renaissance, we're going to go real fast here. In the Renaissance, what we have in here are called set pieces. That's the term for them in the industry, and it has been since the 1860s. Set pieces are things which are made on a frame from flowers, fresh or dried, in some kind of a design. Okay, and that's still the term in the trade. The trade still makes some of these things. I may be the last man alive who's actually made a Gateshead jar, like the big one in there. So, I may be the last person that's ever actually made one, because I used to own like 20 of those frames, but they're long gone, unfortunately. But at any rate, in the Renaissance, they did a lot with flower work, and they did these similar kind of things, but with wicker. Those are wire forms that you probably saw them on my display there. Those are wire forms. They use wicker, and apparently there was some young nobleman who was famous for this, but since it was discontinued because it was so laborious and so time-consuming, it didn't last very long. This is in Renaissance Italy. They had it right. They probably had 20 or 30 people stemming and wiring the Immortelles onto that big Gateshead jar. And they didn't have the picks they used, the wood picks, were not pre-wired. They had to put the wires on them. Wired picks didn't come along until 1898. So it was a lot of labor doing these things. A pick is a wooden thing, could be wired to, with a little wire on it, in which you can bind flowers on it to make it stick in. These are wired picks, and they came in a lot of sizes. The ones in there, by the way, are generally are picks this size here. Very short, and shorter. This size here. Here. You're allowed to touch these, man. That's Cowie. They made these a foot long, both in green, natural, and in brown. They made them with the wires and without the wires. This is where to use them without the wires. But someone had to sit there, stand there, and they had to put one of these on every single little bunch of Immortelles. Okay, so we're up to the Renaissance, Tudor England, Queen Elizabeth, people like that. They did some pretty grand things with flowers. Some incredibly grand things. Eventually it got to where nurserymen, gardeners, seedsmen, people who made collected seeds for growing gardens and stuff, they started doing what we call set pieces, design work. I know for a fact that set pieces go back to at least the 1840s, and I think earlier. Nurserymen, people that had greenhouses were doing some of this, sometimes even in the city. There was a guy, the unknown plantsman, in about 1790, was selling flowers to Aaron Burr. We know for a fact that in the 1820s, in the 1820s and 30s, they were doing decorations for balls and stuff, and they were out of seed stores. They were a combination of seed store, nursery. So there were even some greenhouses in Lower Manhattan, believe it or not. So what happens then? Something came along called the Civil War, and more people died in that than in any other war. Well, with all this death, there came more of an appreciation or desire to do flowers. They're pretty, they're somewhat comforting, they make the body look less horrendous, hopefully. Well, right about the time of the Civil War, and probably before, a guy named Adolphe Lamotte, the patron saint of my industry, was a stowaway on a ship from Germany. He was from Alsace-Lorraine. He had apparently floral training, growing, nursery, whatever, in the old country. And he was stealing flowers from Central Park, water lilies and this and that and the other, making up bouquets and selling them on the streets of New York. And then he made a deal with the Japanese fan company. Japanese goods were very popular, in the big cities. And they let him store his stuff in their basement, and I think he even slept there. Well, he turned this into a fairly major floral business and became the premier floral designer in New York. He had a shop, I think, by 1858. He wasn't the first one, but he had a shop. He was the first to incorporate. He won medals. They gave out medals at the American Academy of something. They gave out medals. He won medals for several things. He is the man who invented the gates ajar, and I believe wire set pieces. The wire frames were immensely popular. Now, it's a lot of labor, and you say, why would they go through this much labor? The truth is, they did not have a lot of long stem flowers. If you look at photographs from Civil War up until like the 20s and 30s even, what's the one thing you don't see? We see a body laid out with the broken columns, gates ajar, hearts, crosses. The one thing you don't see are vases with tall flowers. So everything had to be, because these flowers were mostly short stem. They only have a stem about this long. And so they all had to be put on some kind of an artificial stem. And it lent itself to tighter things. As time went on, and you get back into more modern times, you start seeing the set piece, but you see them looser. You see big arrangements at the base, which are considerably looser than what you see in these older things. Now the problem with the Immortelles is that in a photograph of a lot of pieces, you really can't tell them so much from the other set pieces, which are made with fresh flowers, because they're all done very tightly. I've never seen a single antique trade catalog, because they made set pieces you could order from a florist supply company. You could order them. You could buy them glued on pasteboard or on the wire frames. They're more expensive on the wire frames. But I've never seen a trade catalog picturing the Immortelle ones. I knew that they were doing them. Immortelle crosses and wreaths decorated the bier of Robert E. Lee. They were on the Lincoln funeral quite a bit. On poor little Willie, William Wallace Lincoln. Quite a few they were used, and they were used in conjunction with fresh flowers too. That big gates ajar was Immortelles, which were dried, but there was also fresh greens. There was ivy that came down. There may have been some fresh flowers in that big urn in the center. I don't know for sure. I can't really tell. At any rate, Immortelles, they grow in this. They grew up on the hill on my property naturally. They were planted at some point. They were largely produced in France and in Belgium, Germany, large crops. And they're called immortelle because they last a long, long time. Now the natural color is yellow. And you cut them, they dry a beautiful yellow, you bunch them. And when they were importing these, and they imported lots of them, it's a huge crop, it's a huge import item, the yellow ones are always the cheapest. Why? Because that's a natural color. They just had to cut them, dry them, bunch them, and off they go. White, they had to bleach. Other colors, they had to bleach, they had to dye them, they had to dry them, and they had to tie them. And the labor was like triple on it. That was poetic, wasn't it? At any rate, they were more expensive. Now, a gentleman named Peter Henderson, he came from Scotland. He worked for some lord in some castle that had greenhouses. He slept on the greenhouse floor in bad weather to make sure the fires didn't go out and the plants died. That's something. He had his own establishment here by the 1850s, and he worked for some apparently noted seedsman nurseryman in downtown New York City. And he said, in the 1840s, that set pieces were done, used a wreath either with a hoop of iron from a wheel or willow bent and then wired. Crosses were two pieces of wood put together. And apparently others were done also. I'm not sure. And I have never seen pictures of an actual one made on the wood pre-wire. So they may be out there, but I've not seen them. At any rate, moss was used a lot. Moss was heavily used. But this guy, Lamotte, invents wire set pieces, and they were really quite chic. They used them at parties, not the gates ajar, but they had urns, they had hearts, they had all lyres and harps. For funerals, oftentimes the lyre or the harp had a broken string. And on those the strings, they had to tie or wire flowers around every single one. But what they did, and it depended, the ones with the dried flowers, Immortelles, were done very similar to the fresh flowers. Now, Peter Henderson, who had 400 acres of glass greenhouse in Jersey City, right across from Manhattan, Jersey City, New Jersey. He also had an establishment in Manhattan. You know, Edith Wharton, who wrote The Age of Innocence, mentions that this party they had for the Countess Lewenska, this reputation was a little bit seedy. There were roses from Henderson's. I mean, it was a pretty big deal. And he had catalogs, and he shipped all over the country. Oh yeah, he started importing Immortelles in the year 1866. But he said he started importing them this season because there had been such a demand for them, which means that they were doing these long before. And they were using Immortelles. They grow right here, but they were using them in little vase arrangements. But apparently these things were being made, being used by florists who did this type of thing well before the Civil War. And I have not got that locked down yet, but I never stopped trying. It's at any rate. So what they did was you took your wire frame, and if it was for fresh flowers, you soaked it. You soaked it in water, squeezed some of the excess out, and you carefully filled the frame. If you filled it too tight, you couldn't get the flowers in. If you used it too loose, the flowers fell out. The wood picks, they made the flowers go in easier, but they also did something else. The wood swelled up and helped tighten and keep the thing together. Okay. Now, on the dried ones, they probably, we don't think it happened. I haven't ever proved that they did it here, that they used glue. They did dry moss in them, put the wood pick on. I think they probably dipped them in some glue in some cases and stuck them in. I thought I saw one pick in there that's sticking out that had glue on it, but I can't swear to it. And my eyes aren't what they used to be either, so let's say it. So, you put the moss in. For a fresh one, you put the moss in. On a pillow, you started in the corners. First, you lined it with lead foil, tin foil. That's to keep the moss from falling out the back. The front you kept open. The big pillow in there, the back of it is lined with just old thick brown paper. That was just to keep the moss from falling out. Now, some of these old books even say when you're using fresh flowers, you can use paper, thick paper. I don't see how that could have worked with wet moss. It would have, it would have gotten wet, soggy. It would have had to been pretty thick paper. Tin foil was used also, probably more with the lead content, to back them to keep the moss from falling out. One of these, the Faith, Hope, and Charity, which is the cross, the heart, and the anchor, has what appears to be lead foil backing. It's done with moss. So you put the lead foil backing in, you stuffed in the moss carefully, and then you bound it. Some of these are bound with twine. The great big pillow and the gates ajar are done with twine. The little Faith, Hope, and Charity is done with a very thin wire. You bound the wire frames a little bit. They were kind of like chicken wire, but they were like at right angles. They were like, and they were three-dimensional. And so they would take the wire or the twine and kind of bind it around just to make it a little tighter, to help the moss not fall out. And this was important. This is more important than sticking the flowers in a pretty way. I've had designers work for me who stuck flowers in beautifully, and then it fell apart as the guy was carrying it to the van because their mechanics sucked. That's that's the problem with that. So they would fill it with wet moss for fresh. They would sometimes green it up around the edge. Now the big pillow in there, that was greened up with German status, and the newspaper accounts say with greens, graceful green, like grasses. If they were grass there, it's disappeared. What's there now is German status, which might have been put in fresh and then dried. It might have been put in dry because when it's dried, it looks fine. It's white. I didn't see any evidence of any grasses, but those would be pretty fragile. They probably got knocked off, whatever. So then you could put like an edging of a fern, some kind of pretty greens, and some of these were on stands, and the ferns and the greens help hide the stand. In other words, if you're looking at it, there's wire legs sticking up where the ferns and greens sort of hid that. And then I don't know if that happened in this case here. So then what you do is you figure out and it took hundreds of flowers. You figure out what your pattern's going to be, and you put the flowers on the picks and you start putting them in. And I always enjoyed this. I've done it the modern way, hearts, crosses, big bleeding hearts with 250, 300 roses in them, that type of thing. I enjoy this type of work. I don't get, if it takes 2 hours to do it, I don't care. But at any rate, and now oftentimes they put mottos on them. Dearest aunt, mother, things like that. Uncle, father, stuff like that. And in one of my portfolios down there, I have a whole thing of the different types of script. They made script out of Immortelles. They glued it onto pasteboard. They had script that was made with like cords. It was like a ribbon, but it was like a cord, a twisted cord, and you could write things on with that. They had paper embossed, gilt embossed paper. They had immortelles that were ground up and glued, dyed ground and glued on. Then they had prongs on the back that you could stick into the moss. Also, very popular, and this was used at Grant's funeral when he was laid out in New York City in the City Hall. They had taxidermic doves. They were real doves that were stuffed, usually with the wings out. And oftentimes they'll put like a white ribbon in its beak, and it would say, you know, gone to heaven, or gone and not forgotten, or something like that. Now this guy, Adolphe Lamolt, who invented set piece wire frames with me, he made several major things for the New York City observance when Grant died. And also, I have an article in my portfolio, which I don't know if you have read it or not, but California shipped an entire couple of boxcars full of floral tributes made in California. One of them was a horse with General Grant seated on it, 13 feet tall, which was in pieces and had to be put together. And it even says what everything was made out of. Now, on the dried ones, very similar to the fresh ones. And sometimes they mix. Sometimes they mixed immortelles. The little anchor there, I saw that anchor online, and and I knew right away that that wasn't made with immortelles. It was laying flat. I couldn't see it up because it was laying flat, but I could tell that it was either fresh flowers that had dried or artificial, and it turned out to be artificial. Sometimes the immortelles, they came in bunches. I think the last thing I read was they came in bunches. The yellow ones 150 because they were easy. The dyed ones or the bleached ones were only 100 stems. Each stem had about 8 to 12 little flowers clustered at the top. So you could break off one little stem, put the wood pick on. Others you had to piece them. Some of these I noticed were little tiny individual, about the size of a pea, these flowers, a big pea, with a little stem about that long. And someone took those by, when they broke off, someone took those by hand, 5, 6, 7, and then laboriously with fine wire wired those. Why they didn't go blind, I don't know. Things like straw flowers, the German status, Senuata status, which is a flatter, fuller kind of status, was used. And they oftentimes mixed artificial flowers, especially when fresh flowers were in short supply. Remember, when florists had to grow their own, if there was no sun, there wasn't, so they were very careful in their use of flowers. The sun didn't shine, you didn't have that many flowers. And they oftentimes would take they'd have a big thing of green, could be like a podium or something, and they would sort of dot the fresh flowers on and then fill in with immortelles or something. Lots of wide ribbons to hide. I've done that in my own time when I didn't buy enough flowers, but that's another story. At any rate, as you can see, they're pretty sturdy. They've held up a long time. The conservators they're pondering now what's the best way to conserve these. Now, if these flowers were made 5 years ago, I'd say mist them with blow the dust off of them with a hairdryer, and mist them with warm water. You can do that. Some dried flowers you can even submerge in warm water for a little while, and they'll sort of come back. But they use very wide ribbons on these. They had the doves. Some of these things are you think are kind of corny in a way. Well, at the time they were quite chic and sophisticated. There was a writer in the 30s who wrote a book about flower arrangement, and he arrogantly said, Williams was the guy's name. He arrogantly said, "Stiffness, pomposity, and not a little insincerity characterize the floral design of our Victorian predecessors." No, they were locked into this type because that's what they had to work with. I often wondered, if they had had lots of long-stem flowers, carnations, alstroemeria, roses, would they have come up with this difficult and laborious?
No.
Yeah, possibly not. I think there would have been a mixture. I think they did. Remember, they liked everything busy. Is there anything in that house that doesn't have some kind of design on it and stuff? The Victorian period, there was a revolution in horticulture, agriculture, along with a revolution in printing, which occurred. And more horticultural, agricultural, florist books were published in that from 1850 on than in the first 200 years before that. Before they had florist publications specifically to our trade, there were like the American Agriculturalist. There were different farmers and agricultural magazines that occasionally had things about floristry, but not all that often. At any rate, so this is how they were made. And they survived here because this became a museum almost from the moment Grant left here. They have been knocked around, but they are in amazing shape. Yes, sir.
I just want to understand one thing.
Yes,
because
sir.
for years we've been asked by different people coming through,
Uh-huh.
how are these preserved? At one time we were told they were hand dipped in beeswax. Do I understand that
No,
nothing has been put on
The
them?
only thing that's dipped in wax are the artificial cloth and paper flowers and the small anchor, which is laying on the table there.
So there's nothing put on the flowers?
No, sir. When I saw that, no, sir. If beeswax would put it, it would still be there, and it is not there. Be there, get it, beeswax. At any rate,
So they started out with dried flowers.
oh yeah, these were these were not done fresh and then dried. These began as dried flowers. They were mostly Immortelles, which had already been dried, had been dyed already. No florist in their right mind would you could grow them yourself, but then you'd have to like bleach them if you wanted different colors, and who has to? And these frames were made. They were made in several different kinds of hearts, several different kinds of crowns, several different kinds of crosses. Several. I mean, the Faith, Hope, and Charity. There's all kinds of variations. Hourglasses, urns. It goes on and on and on. And as the years went by, they still made these, but they would put longer, looser flowers down at the base. Kind of. They get a little more open as you get more longer stem flowers. So. Anybody have any questions?
How long does it take to make a Gateshead jar?
The size of the one that's in there now, today, to make they probably had a lot of people, maybe 8 or 10 or a dozen, doing the wiring and on putting the flowers on the picks, and the head designers or who were inserting them. I don't think they made a lot of the Gateshead jar in standard sizes, and I could show you a catalog that shows the different sizes, maybe 8 or 10 different sizes. I think that was probably custom made. Now they made a lot of pillows. The big pillow possibly was a standard size. It's just big. It would have, but this got here very shortly after he died. They didn't have a lot of time to make. There were quite a few nurserymen, seedsmen, florists here. This was a big tourist place. There was a lot of wealthy people coming from New York, and I'm sure they had places that were capable of making some of this stuff. This book is 1900s, and here we have. Right after the Civil War, one of the set pieces was like a bedroll and a knapsack on the back for soldiers. USA 15H. All right. Okay, this one was $12 to $20, and it was 20, and that's 26 inches tall. $12 to $20. This is the GAR symbol, I'm told, by people who know what they're talking about. All right, this one came in several. This one, 36 inches was $16 to $20. 30 inches was $12 to $14, and 24 inches was $8 to $10. But $8 to $10 in 1890 was what?
That was real money.
Like more than 100, a couple of hundred. For 50 years, I have gone all over this country, in search of this type of thing, and I've done very well. I've done very well for a boy from Wichita, Kansas, in that sense. These are the only ones we know from the period that are still intact. Now, the frames, I used to own jointly with a florist, I owned about 20 some of these. Not as big as that. Our biggest one were about like this. We have the arch, the fallen arch. It's an arch with a keystone, and the keystone is fallen at the bottom, showing that sun. There was the broken column, the end of life. There's the harp with the string broken. Things like that. There's the clock, and you stop the hands. Now, as recently as 5-6 years ago, I saw the cardboard clock faces for sale at florist wholesale places with the hands. You can put the hand where at the time. My view is this: the smaller ones could easily fit into a shadow box. And in my portfolio, you'll see I was at an antique show in New York City 30 years ago, and a woman had one of the sheaves of wheat with a cardboard pasteboard sickle with Immortelles that had been part of a funeral design that had been used at McKinley's funeral. He was in Ohio. It was in Ohio. She was from Ohio. She said there was a sticker on the back, and it was largely intact. It was just part of a funeral. So I'm convinced that some of these were small enough that someone might have well taken a wreath or a cross or something and put it into some kind of shadow box, which is now sitting in an attic of a Victorian house, totally forgotten. Yeah, because you could make a Gateshead jar this big and only this wide, and you could get that into a showcase, into like a glass-fronted, picture-framed, deep show, like they'd make a diorama in. This is the only wire and willow basket I've found. Now they made gates ajar. They must have made it big enough to, you know, they made hearts, they made crowns, they made lyres. So, but this is the only piece, and it's identical. You'll see right down here. This is Peter Henderson's shrine. He and Adolphe Lamotte, the saints that the floral world should be worshiping at that altar, because that's what got us to where we are now. But this is identical to a piece up here called the low oval. Okay, so that, I mean, and I still look, I go antiquing all the time, and I just have never seen another one. And I've never seen I've seen some of the wire frames. I have never seen anything still intact though, ever.
So do we still have them primarily because they were just
Because it
pretty
wasn't,
much left,
it was left.
just left
I
and
think
not
they were
disturbed?
not kicked around too much. They were disturbed a little. There was some damage. The big gates ajar is low. It's got people knocked into it accidentally. You know, the hand pump vacuum probably knocked it a couple of times. There was reverence toward it because they were for. I keep forgetting that Grant was a big deal. He like won. He like won a war. If you look at my portfolio, you'll see a gates ajar made for the funeral of President Jefferson Davis too. So, you know, this is not a one-sided deal here, but because of the reverence for the man, and this became a museum very quickly. There's been a little damage, but clearly they thought that they were significant enough. Someone had the brains to not let them get banged up. They are an amazing state of preservation. Immortelles are a tough kind of dried flower, but to be this old, I mean, I've seen eucalyptus, which is tough. You know, eucalyptus, I've seen it treated with glycerin. I've seen it after 5 years looking like an elephant walked on it, you know.
How long did they keep them? What was the practice in terms of keeping after the funeral? Did they dispose immediately?
Well, I think some of them got kept and put in glass frames. Remember, they made those wreaths out of hair and shells and things as memorial things. I think some probably sat around for a while before they got thrown out. They could have been taken apart, and you could use them with moss and fresh greens for Christmas. They even use gates ajar at Christmas time, anchors, crosses, whatever. Cemeteries probably sold them back to the florist. So, yes, ma'am.
How do you preserve them?
You know, there's a couple of ways. If these weren't so old, what you could do is gently blow the dust off them with the hairdryer or something. If you could find some kind of an archival glue that was not shiny and didn't get gooky, that would like the beeswax that would preserve them, maybe spray the front of them or something. I think the only real way, frankly, is in a controlled environment, whether it's in cabinets, cases, all glass. I heard the conservatives say someone has just, well, if we put them in cabinets, glass, let's make them look, you know, like Eastlake style design, like most of the furniture and stuff in the house. Mm-hmm. At this point, having talked to the conservators, I'm of the opinion that the best way would probably be either in a room hermetically sealed or in cases. There's quite a few pieces, not a lot, that have fallen off. There's some that are laying there that have fallen that can be put back, and if not in the exact spot, in a spot that needs it. I wouldn't take new immortelles and try to fill in, but there's some conservative work that can be done. I think probably hermetically sealed glass cases where they can't get dusty or faded. And what could be done, I'm not suggesting anybody redo these new in the original colors because I haven't got the rest of my life to do it. Maybe facsimiles could be, or even a talented artist could maybe do some paintings or something showing what they looked like when they were, because we know the colors on most of them. The book over there, A Centennial History of the American Florist, that was done when Florist Review magazine was going to be 100 years old in 96, 97. They were the third publication for florists. Before that, agricultural magazines, even Godey's Ladies Book, had articles about florals, flowers, designing, that kind of thing. In 1884, the Society of American Florists was founded to represent just florists, who also, most florists grew most of their own flowers. They didn't buy them from some wholesaler. Prior to that, in the year 1876, the bicentennial of the American Republic, they called a nurseryman's centennial in Chicago in conjunction with some other meeting, and they formed what's known as the Association of Seedsmen, Florists, the American Association of Seedsmen, Florists, and Nurserymen. People selling seeds and plants, people who had nurseries selling plants, and florists who grew flowers and plants and did floral design work. By 1884, the needs of the florists sort of outgrew that association. And they were really at loggerheads a lot. So the florists formed their own organization, the Society of American Florists, which was 100 years old in 1884. They were, for a time, the most powerful agricultural association in this country, for a time. And the whole floral business was growing like mad. By the 20s, it was virtually accessible to most Americans. And florists grew most of their own flowers. If you, like around here, probably some of the florists around this had greenhouses. And then they did the designing at the potting bench. You know, you usually step down 2 or 3 steps. You came into the shop, you stepped down 2 or 3 steps, and there was the greenhouse behind you. And then there was an area where they had the boiler, which is called the stock hole, S-T-O-C-K. What they really meant was stoke, S-T-O-K-E, like to stoke a fire. But in the trade, it was the stock hole. That's just the way they did it. So they organized rather dramatically between 1876 and 1884. And then when the wire services came along, FTD was now FTD with personal computers where you can just go on to see who the florist is in Cincinnati or Tanganyika, and you can just call her and send your own. But in those days, they were all telegraphed. You know, you went to a flower shop, you put the order in, they telegraphed it to the florist in Cincinnati or whatever. They were quite powerful.
So where did the everlasting or immortelles come from?
Well, these probably came from France. France, somehow the soil there was good there. France, Germany, Belgium, probably mostly from France. It was a huge import item. And we exported pampas grass from California. We exported, because they loved it, we exported a lot. There's pampas grass, by the way, used in the feathering on the ends of that pillow.
The dried flowers were imported, so they were, stock.
Yeah, not all dried flowers, but immortelles in particular. You could grow Helchrysium, straw flowers, Britzia, the quaking grass, which is also in that pillow. Florists did grow a lot of their own, status, and dry a lot of their own. But you took masses. I'd like to know how many bunches of immortelles it took to make that Gateshead jar.
You don't want to
No,
know.
that would be hard. If you wanted to do a heart that's this big and this wide out of red roses, you're going to need 250 to 300 red roses. I can tell you that. But those are just little things. So they'll imagine the labor of having to put. Now, if the stem was strong enough, they had 8 or 10 flowers on the end. You break it off. You still had to put it on the wood pick, and sometimes they put them on wire picks. There's a kind of a funny story. The dried flowers will burn. They'll burn because they're flammable. Because, well, I have a story like in my portfolio. There are some florists, I think it was Baltimore, used matchsticks. He used them with the match heads on them. Now you could buy matchsticks in different lengths and just cut them up. He got in a hurry, and they were immortelles, dried flowers. And apparently the horse and wagon, the delivery wagon's going down the street, and a match head rubs on the wire frame, sets them on fire. They got the horse unhitched in time. But this sort of signals the arrival of the full-service florist. Sort of coincides with the development of set pieces. And then when Lincoln went on a funeral train from D.C. to New York and all the way to Springfield. And he was interred in the crypt there. It was a temporary crypt until they built the big monument. And one of the newspapers, and I have the account, says that friends and neighbors from Springfield brought flowers, and they were in vases. And there's even a photo taken of the crypt before the doors were shut. And there's all these vases of flowers. And the newspaper account says, nothing wired or set was placed into them. So that's 1865, 65. They were using the term, nothing wired or set, So they did do vase arrangements. They just didn't have like a lot of tall flowers. So, yes, ma'am.
So is your best guess that these were yellow?
No. My best guess is they were mostly white. The newspaper accounts say so they were bleached. And then the purple ones, for instance, the epaulets across the epaulets across the sword in there, the 4 stars.
Yeah.
Those were bleached white. I believe there's blue. Those would have been bleached and dyed. They're gold. Yellow was the original color. But I wonder if maybe they didn't use some darker. They were mostly white.
Okay.
I mean, Jefferson Davis, the one for Jefferson Davis, when he lay in state in Raleigh, North Carolina, says "Our President," probably in purple immortelles. I haven't got a big enough photo of it yet. His was all white with greenery, and it had 2 urns on the top. And instead of a central urn, it had a star, and it was only about this big. Compared to Grant, So compared to Grant's, I mean, if you want to make comparisons, you know. But I saw a documentary about I think the History Channel, and there was Ben showing these pieces, and I got up and I almost fainted, and I got down on my knees and almost cried. Where's Grant's cottage? Oh, it's upstate up by Saratoga. They're still there. I mean, what? You know, Grant's family? I said, no. Funeral designs, you know, were sent at the time. The woman who owned Florist Review magazine for many, many years, who championed that book, her company put out that book, which I wrote the first chapter and edited for historical accuracy. She was almost in tears when I told her about this. We're going to start pushing the floral industry to support preserving these. Yeah, this is very, very important. You know, to our industry, this is mega important.